What's in a name, right? I think about the names we go by. My mom told me how she got my name. I guess when you're pregnant, you watch a lot of TV, okay? And so my mom, I can't even tell you the show. She told me once, but I forgot it. But my name was from a television show. It was some kind of character's name was Darian. And I was like, that's interesting. That's not a name you hear or see very often on TV. Camille always tells me that her parents got her name out of a baby book. Now, what's interesting about her name is they wanted a name that would translate well both in English and Portuguese. And so, because, she spent the first 10 years of her life in Victoria, Brazil. And so that's why I always tell people my wife is from Brazil, not from Oklahoma. So that's how she got her name. It's Camilla, I believe. It's not. Well, who knows? But it's Camilla, Camille, whatever. Also in Portuguese, but it's Camille in English. So it's a name that can be used in both circumstances. So it's good. And so names are important, right? When I have a relationship with somebody, it's probably good that I know their name, right? Not only is it good that I know their name, it's probably important that when I'm talking to Ryan, for instance, that I say, "Hey, Ryan, how are you?" Because then it's like, well, number one, he knows I'm talking to him, and number two, I'm using his name, right? And so it's names are important, and it's nice to be known by your name. And speaking of names, we're going to be looking at a situation where names are being used. But if you have your Bibles, turn with me over to Genesis chapter 16. We're going to be looking at verses 1 through 6. Again, that's Genesis chapter 16, verses 1 through 6. All right. All right, Genesis chapter 16, starting in verse 1, it says this. Now Sarai, Abram's wife, had borne him no children, but she had an Egyptian slave named Hagar. So she said to Abram, "The Lord has kept me from having children. Go sleep with my slave. Perhaps I can build a family through her." Abram agreed to what Sarai said. So after Abram had been living in Canaan for 10 years, Sarai, his wife, took her Egyptian slave and gave her to her husband to be his wife. He slept with Hagar, and she conceived. When she knew she was pregnant, she began to despise her mistress. Then Sarai said to Abram, "You are responsible for the wrong that I am suffering. I put my slave in your arms, and now that she knows she is pregnant, she despises me. May the Lord judge between you and me. Your slave is in your hands," Abram said. "Do with her whatever you think best." Then Sarai mistreated Hagar, so she fled from her. So last week, we talked about the promise that God gave Abram. We talked about that Abram went to God, and God telling him, "I'm going to make your descendants as numerous as the stars." And Abram says, "I have told God I have no children. How are you going to do this?" And God tells Abram, "No, you will have children, and they will be as numerous as the stars." Well, Sarai is aware of this situation. Sarai is aware that she is childless. And what does the Bible tell us? It says God has kept her from having children. So what does she do? she has to come up with a plan. She has to devise a plan. But what we don't see here is why she is saying, why has God kept me from having children? Now, it's possible that maybe she is being punished for things of her ancestors, or maybe she is being punished for sin, because we have to understand that in that time period, they believed that if bad things happened to you, you did something to upset God, or somebody in your family did something to upset God. And so this has got to be in the background of something that we have to be considering could be happening. So she was not having children, so what does she do? She devises a plan. She says, I want you to take my slave, and I want you to have children with her. And not only do I want you to take my slave and have children with her, because that's one thing, right? But it's another where she also says, I want you to take that a step further, and I want you to make her your wife as well. And so Abram, he agrees. And what's interesting here is we have to understand in some weird way that is Sarai is being sacrificial in a way. She's allowing her slave to be the person who will bring children to their name, but also she's saying, no longer am I going to be the only wife in the household, but now you're going to have another wife. Now, this is not, as weird as this is, this whole situation, and none of us can even imagine what that would be like in our world today. This actually is not uncommon practice. It's actually not even uncommon practice in our Bible. With Jacob and Leah and Rachel, we see a situation like this as well. One of the prime examples of that is in Genesis 30. So if you want to go back and look at that, Rachel's not able to have children, but she wants children, right? Because she is the wife that Jacob loves. And so what happens then is she says, go and take my servant to have children with you. And so in that way, the children of that person would be her children by law. It's really weird and it's really confusing. But that was actually a kind of a common practice back in that era. And so it's not uncommon for that to happen. Well, ultimately what happens is all of this takes place, and then, the slave becomes pregnant. And not only now is she pregnant, she's also Abram's wife. And so what we have to realize here, what's going on is it seems to be there's this competition that's going on of who is the better wife. Well, I was able to bear Abram children. What have you done, Sarai? And so what happens is the slave becomes to despise Sarai. In other words, I am the better of the wives because I am able to have children. And Sarai is upset. She felt like she has done this sacrificial thing, and she goes to Abram, who is the patriarch of the family. For those of you who do not know what that is, basically what that needs to mean is the man is the head of the house, okay? He's the leader of the family. So anyway, so she goes to the man who is the head of the family, the one who's supposed to be the leader of the family, and she tells him that what is going on about this atrocity, that how dare the slave thinks she is better than me. Did I not allow her to go and conceive, and did I not allow her to then have status by becoming your wife? And what Abram does here, well, he decides basically to take the most passive approach ever. Hey, Abram's responsibility here would be to take care of the situation and make it right. Instead, what does Abram say? He says, no, that's your slave. That's your problem. You take care of the problem. And what happens is then all of a sudden, Sarai goes in and begins to mistreat Hagar so horribly that she runs away. Now, here's what I want you guys to notice. For those of you who still have your Bibles open, I want you to notice something. Notice who uses the word Hagar. It's not Abram. It's not Sarai. They don't call her by her name. Her name in this passage is slave. Only the narrator calls her by her name, and we'll talk about who else calls her by name here in just a moment. So she is just the slave in this situation. And so that's her name, is the slave. And what happens is the slave is mistreated so severely. I mean, we have to realize how bad this has to be. She is mistreated so badly that she would rather survive in the wilderness with all the dangers of that time and era, snakes, heat, elements, bandits, whatever. She would rather run to the wilderness than to live with Abram and Sarai. Let's put that in another term. She would rather run to the wilderness where there's more than likely potential death than to be around the people of God. That's what she would rather do. Because that is better than the mistreatment that she is experiencing in her current situation. And truthfully, I don't think many of us, maybe some of us have experienced things on that level, but I do believe there are going to be moments when we may feel like Hagar, that any place is better than our current situation. Or any place is better than the place that we've been in. I mean, let's face it. Some of us grew up in difficult homes. Some of us grew up with difficult and challenging situations in families. So, some of you have maybe felt like your family, maybe you didn't feel loved or appreciated or wanted. Maybe some of you grew up with an alcoholic parent. Maybe some of you grew up in a household that was raised in a divorce. And maybe in some of those situations you were beaten. And not just spanked, you were literally beaten. Maybe some of you grew up with stepfathers who did unthinkable things. And you felt like there is anywhere is better than where I'm at right now. There's any place, anything. Like Hagar, maybe you felt like death would be better than being in that home. And so you would rather run away or go away or do anything to get out of that situation. Or maybe some of you have spent time in toxic relationships or in toxic relationships. Or maybe you're in a tough season in your marriage. They all come. There are moments when it feels like the only thing you do is argue and fight. That's all your relationship is. And there can be that moment where it would just feel better to get out of it. And I'm happy for all of you that have stuck through it. But there are some things where it's just so bad in other ways that there's no choice but to leave. But for some of us, we've been in those toxic relationships. We've been in those toxic moments. Some of us, maybe, you've been in a toxic workplace. And that can be stressful, right? Where all you do is you go and you're angry and you're frustrated with everything that's going on in your job, and currently what happens is you take it home. Maybe you're dealing with untruthful and untrustworthy bosses. Maybe you're dealing with untrustworthy coworkers, and it's a difficult situation that you're in, and it would be easier and better on your conscience if you just left. But then, like 99% of the people in this room, you may have experienced those things, but you also realize that you have children at home. And unfortunately, whether you work at a good place or not, the light bill still has to get paid. And so you're dealing with those situations, and you're noticing that it's making you a grumpy and bad person, and all you want to do is run. And truthfully, when we're in those moments, it can feel like there is no hope, and it will never get any better. It may get to a point where you're no longer thinking about the future. You're just thinking about, how do I get out of this situation? I think for many of us, we've all had moments like that. We've all experienced what that's like. But I will tell you, there is hope for those who hold on. There's hope for those who hold on. So we're going to pick back up in our text in verse 7, where it says this, "And then the angel of the Lord found Hagar near a spring in the desert. It was the spring that is beside the road to Shur, and said, 'Hagar, slave of Sarai, where have you come from? And where are you going?' 'I'm running away from my mistress Sarai,' she answered. Then the angel of the Lord said to her, 'Go back to your mistress and submit to her.' The angel added, 'I will increase your descendants so much that they will be too numerous to count.' The angel of the Lord said to her, 'You are now pregnant, and you will give birth to a son. You shall name him Ishmael, for the Lord has heard your misery. He will be a wild donkey of a man. His hand will be against everyone, and everyone's hand against him. And he will live in hostility towards all of his brothers.' She gave this name to the Lord, who spoke to her, 'You are the God who sees me.' For she said, 'I have now seen the one who sees me.' That is why the well was called Bir Lahai-roi. It is still there between Kadesh and Bered. So Hagar bore Abram a son, and Abram gave him the name Ishmael, to the son she had bore. Abram was 86 years old when Hagar bore him Ishmael." I want us to notice something. We finally see in the beginning of this passage, somebody refers to the slave by her name, other than the narrator. He says, "Hagar, slave of Sarai, where are you going?" So God cared enough about her to call her by name. And if I'm going to call her by name, or if he's going to call her by name, that means he knows her. God knows Sarai. And so he calls her by name. But the truth is what does she say? She says, "I'm running from my mistress Sarai." Well, there's a problem there. See, Hagar is not thinking about the future. She's not. She's not thinking about, what is this going to look like 10 days from now? No, she's thinking about, all she is thinking about is, how do I get out of this situation? And how far can I go to get away from this horrible, horrendous time and period of her life? And so all she's wanting to do is run away from her past. And I would assume is her plan is hopefully to go back to Egypt. But she doesn't know what that looks like. She's not prepared. I don't know how much provisions she probably took with her. But all she was doing is running as fast and as far as she can. She's not focused on the future. She's only focused on getting away from her past and the situation that she finds herself in. But what does God tell her to do? God tells her to go back. God tells her to go back, but He gives her a promise. He tells her, hey, your descendants are also going to be as numerous as the stars. But not just are your descendants going to be as numerous as the stars, but I've got to be honest with you. It's going to be difficult for your son. But you're going to name him Ishmael, which literally means God hears. But you're going to name him Ishmael. He's going to be a wild donkey of a man, and he will be in constant strife with his brothers. And for those of you who do not know, Ishmael is known as the father of Islam. And if we think about the history of Islam and the relationships that it's had with Christianity and Judaism, it has been one of conflict. So God didn't soften it or lie to her. He told her it's going to be difficult. It's going to be a struggle, but you can rest and know that you have a future. And it may not always be easy and it may not always be bright, but it's important that you go back. Because what God has planned for your life and for your descendants has still yet to come. And so you have a future and you have a hope. And what happens then is, as Hagar listens to all of this, she tells God and she names God. Now what's interesting is the messenger basically tells him that he is Yahweh, or I am. He goes and he tells him, I am Yahweh. And so he already tells her his name. But she names God anyway. And she's the first one in our Bible to give God a name. And what does she give him the name? She says, you are the God who sees me. Nobody else is looking at me. Nobody else cares about me. I was given as a wife to Abram, and he could care less. He let me just leave. But you are the God who sees me. And not only is the God that sees her, He's also the God who hears her. And He cares enough to know her by name. It's pretty amazing when things are going really rough, right? And yet when there's somebody who comes to you and cares enough to sit down with you and talk to you, right? You're the God who sees me. And so what does she do? She goes back. Now, it's not forever, because the Bible does tell us that what happens is eventually she does leave, and we'll talk about that. But for now, Ishmael needed a home. He needed somebody to help raise him. He needed to be taken care of. And he needed to be able to grow strong and old enough to where when the day comes for them to go, he would be able to make the journey. But what we need to understand is that God sees and hears our hurts and our pains, and He is also with us the entire way. God's with us. He never left us. He's always right there. And so just as God saw Hagar, and He heard Hagar, and He called her by name, we need to understand that God sees and He hears us. No matter what the circumstances, God sees us. And not only does He see us in our hurt, He sees us in our pain, and He hears us, and He listens to our cries, and He listens to our groans and our ooks, and the things that we don't tell anybody else because we don't want them to know that we struggle. God sees and He hears that. And He calls us by name. And He says, "You are my child. Before you were even a thought in your mother's mind, I knew you. I knew you were going to be dealing with these struggles. I knew there were going to be problems. I knew there were going to be hard times. I knew it was going to happen. And I want you to know that I see you and I hear you. It's going to hurt for a while. You may deal with this for a while. You may deal with this pain for a while. But if you stay strong and you stay on the path, you need to understand that He has a plan for your life. He has a plan for your marriage. He has a plan for your children. He has a plan for everything that you have ever gone through, every hurt, every pain, every tear, every night you laid awake staring at the ceiling, wondering if it's going to be another day. He has a plan. It may hurt for a while, but it's not going to be forever. Because God does not leave us in our pain forever, but I do believe He opens the right door at the right time and at the right moment. And you've probably felt in the moment that you're going through hard times, and sometimes we may feel like a rock going through a rock tumbler. Now, here's what's interesting about a rock tumbler. I haven't started polishing rocks, but it's kind of cool. So you drop them in a tumbler, and what happens is it beats up against this whole rock, and it's got jagged edges and everything else. But what happens when it comes out of this rock tumbler is you have this beautiful, smooth rock that people, will place on their mantles and everything else, and it looks amazing. And I do believe that sometimes in life, we're just like rocks going through a rock tumbler. We're getting beat up, we're getting pushed around, but then what happens is that when we get closer, when we get to the day where we get to stand before God, we're this beautiful piece of art that's smooth and shiny. But there's some hurt that comes along the way. And when God opens that right door at the right moment, at the right time, you can step into that freedom that He gives us so freely every day. And I've also come to this conclusion. There are a lot of things that are probably going on in this church. There's probably a lot of things that are going on in your family right now that are very difficult. And you probably don't know what you're going to do. But I also realize in a church of our size that there's a lot of people who have gone through difficult and horrible things that they wish they never would have gone through. That might be similar to what you're going through right now. And I truly believe God places individuals in certain places at certain times so that they can be lights and beacons for us as we're trying to figure out this thing called life. But for those of us who feel like we're in the pits of life, you need to know this as we close. You can trust the God who sees. Why? Because He has a plan for your life. He knows everything that you've ever gone through, and He knows everything that you're going to go through. But here's what I've realized about my walk with God since 2011. Is every moment He has placed the right people at the right time in the right moment to help me get to where I am today. And He kept me from making stupid decisions that would have affected me for the rest of my life. Because God cares. Not only does He see me, but He hears me, and He has called me by name. And I want you to know that God has called you by name. And He wants a relationship with you. He wants you to come to Him and lay your burdens down. And so maybe God has called you to this church today. And you're visiting and you just so happen to do the amazing Google search. I love our name. You just Google churches in Las Cruces, we're like number 3. But you're here today. Maybe that's God calling you to step into a relationship with Him. And you can do that today and through the waters of baptism and become brand new in Christ. Or maybe you're just hurting today, and maybe what I would like to do is I would like to encourage you to not keep that to yourself, but allow somebody else to come mentor you and walk alongside you through whatever situation or difficult time you may be dealing with. You're not meant to do this alone because God sees you and He hears you and He calls you by name.